Hey, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you, Madeline?
If you just want to introduce yourself and tell us briefly about your professional career, education, research, publications.
Absolutely. So, yes, my name is Dr. Antonio C. Cuyler. I am currently the director of the MA program and associate professor of arts administration at Florida State University in the Department of Art Education. I've also, this past academic year, had a visiting associate professor appointment at the University of Michigan in the theater and drama department in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. And with the help of Domi, I founded my consulting practice, which is Kyler Consulting LLC. And we exist to help cultural organizations maximize their performance and community relevance through access, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Um, so one of the ways, or I guess one of the um, like strategies for supporting me doing the work that I do in my consulting practice is a lot of the research that I was doing as a professor, and I've continued to do. In fact, I'm working on my second solo authored book, as well as have a my second or my first edited volume coming out, Arts Management, Cultural Policy, and the African Diaspora. I'm working on another book proposal, and I'm serving on the editor as the editor for another book. And so it's been great because I didn't know I had so many ideas and so many thoughts about this work, and really wanting to work very closely and partnering with cultural organizations of all types to support them through the process of institutionalizing access, diversity, equity, and inclusion as a practice that's integral to their success. And so that's who I am.
So, where are you currently at in your career? And I know you mentioned your business, but what does that necessarily focus on?
One of the great things is about the new academic position that I'm taking on is that I'll be supported and encouraged to continue my consulting work, actually.
Mhm.
Um, and so right now, I'm currently working with some wonderful cultural organizations, some major service arts organizations such as the Chorus America and the League of American Orchestras. I'm also working with the Giving Voice Initiative, which is a chorus that is designed to provide musical opportunities for care givers as well as those suffering from dementia. I'm working with the San Antonio Youth Orchestras, as well as the Winston-Salem Orchestra, and also the Spencer Museum. And so I'm getting to have a mix of like symphony orchestras, museums, choruses. And so I'm hoping and aspiring to work with opera companies, dance companies, and theater companies in the future. So I have a full view of the ways in which access, diversity, equity, and inclusion can be institutionalized in these different cultural organizations. Even though we call them cultural organizations, and that's a general descriptor, but sometimes the art form in and of itself have these specific conventions, cultures, and traditions to them that make institutionalizing access, diversity, equity, and inclusion challenging in very unique and nuanced ways. And so I want to be a part of assisting cultural organizations in navigating that space.
You kind of just touched on this, but I was going to ask you exactly what does ADEI stand for and what is its significance, at least to
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, so ADEI is the acronym for Access, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And some of you may have heard diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity, or JEDI, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or ideas. So there are a bunch of different acronyms in this work. And part of the challenge maybe is that this work is unregulated. And maybe it should be so in terms of like governmental involvement in it. But what that means is that there's a lot of different ways in which people understand how you do this work. that we call, diversity work or social justice work. I use the acronym A.D.E.I because I want access to come at the beginning, and access to me is the initiation of the practice, of the process of the practice. It has to start with making sure that everyone has open doors and unfiltered access to opportunities. And then once you have access achieved, then you can begin to talk about diversity and representation. Because then, like, if you look at diversity and you see that, for example, there are not enough women, reflective of like the number of women in society or in a particular community, then you go back to access and you have to ask a question about, well, how many more doors or how many more ways can we make it possible for women to participate in X? Once you have access and diversity underway, then I think you can begin to have a conversation about equity. Access and diversity are important to ensuring that there is a greater representation of the diversity that exists, even within social groups. So, for example, Black people. Not all Black people are the same. There are some Black Republicans, there are some Black Democrats, there are some Black independents, there are some Black libertarians, right? And so once you have access and diversity in place, you can start talking about equity because theoretically you have created the space for the multiplicity of ways in which a particular social group exists can also participate in the conversation about equity. Equity is a bit more challenging because sometimes people conflate equity to mean equality, and equality and
Mhm.
equity are not the same thing. Equality says everyone gets the same intervention for success, no matter the historic unfairness you have endured as a result of having a marginalized social identity. Equity, on the other hand, asks the question, how can we create successful interventions for success that take into consideration historic unfairness and fairness in addressing historic unfairness, right? So it's like what happened in the past, what's happening right now, and fixing it so that it doesn't happen again in the future. The last piece of the puzzle is inclusion. Inclusion is about well-being, and so theoretically, in my theory is that once you have access, diversity, and equity in place, then you can create the space for belonging for all kinds of people. So it's kind of like, if you think about it, if you had a party and you invited, a lot of different people to the party, do everyone have access to the same possibilities and experiences that the party has to offer? Can everyone enjoy the party in the same ways? Can people, have fun in the same ways at the party? And so, that's why I use the acronym A.D.E.I. And in the new book that I'm working on, I theorize that A.D.E.I are the short-term goals to achieving the long-term goal, which is creative justice, particularly as it relates to the creative sector, which is the sector that I work in. And creative justice is the manifestation of all historically discriminated against, marginalized, oppressed, and subjugated peoples living creative and expressive lives on their own terms.
So, how are you making an impact in the community and through your business? And business, we mean your consulting firm.
Yeah, so LLCs are for-profit business entities, and the diversity industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I remember reading some research that said that a DEI consultant can earn anywhere from $50,000 plus, right, a year. And so one of the challenges I've been struggling with as a for-profit entity is, how do I ethically and socially responsibly do the work that I do without focusing so much on financial impact, right? Like, and financial impact is important because as a result of the revenue that I've generated through the business, like already, for example, this year I am projected to quadruple my revenue from last year. That's great, right? From a
Okay.
financial impact standpoint, because what that means then is that I can employ independent contractors to help me do the work that I need to do to market the business, to market the practices and the interventions that I'm offering up. But I don't want financial impact to be the only impact that I think about. And so I'm beginning to think about impact in terms of community impact, cultural impact, intellectual impact, emotional impact, political and social impact.
So, what can individuals do to be more actively educated in ADEI?
Okay, I'm glad that you asked this question because, we're coming up upon the 2-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder.
Mhm.
And in August of 2020, so like 3 months after George Floyd was murdered, an NPR Ipsos poll um, asked people, to what extent or have you done any work to better understand racial issues in the United States? Um, in the cases of Asian, Hispanic, and Black people, 40% or more said yes, but only 30% of white people said yes. Now, if you think about it, the US population is about 60% white. So if 60% of the population is white and only 30% of white people said that they tried to do some work around learning about racial issues, that means then that maybe half of white people have done some work around trying to learn more about racial issues in the country. And so I would say start by trying to understand the history. Like there is a history of some humans wanting to dominate, oppress, marginalize, and subjugate other humans as a result of their gender, sexual orientation, class, ability, race, religion. So, like, do some work to understand that history. And based on your social identities, you have an entry point into doing this work, right? So, for example, if you are a white woman who happens to be disabled, right? Being a woman and being disabled gives you the intersectional experience of marginality that makes it possible for you to find an entry point into this work. And whereas whiteness may be something that has been a privilege to you or giving you certain advantages in life, you also need to lean into understanding that. And what is the history of white people in the United States having all of this power and privilege to the detriment of people of the global majority living in the United States? Another personal thing that I think people can do is to look at their personal networks, right? Like if you look at your closest friends and then even kind of like the circle around your closest friend and then one more layer out and one more layer out, like how far removed are you from people who are different from you? Are you actively seeking to cultivate healthy, um, strong relationships with people who are not the same as you, right? Like I have friends who are Republicans, right? Like I hate to hark on that, but I want to understand what are Republicans' concerns because if I don't, then how can I debate them, right? How can I seek to try to change their minds in the way that they think about certain things? And so after the 2016 election, some people kind of just shut other folks out because they didn't think like them or vote like them. And I don't know if it's the best way. I understand for some people's emotional, spiritual, physical safety, they feel like they have to protect themselves, and that's the best way to do it. But I wonder if by leaning into the conversations and the discourses, no matter how uncomfortable they may be, if we have more benefit there in building bridges and finding common ground. I think every human wants the ability or the opportunity to live the best possible life. I think every human wants to maximize their potential and understand what that potential is. And these barriers, these forms of oppression, ableism, ageism, adultism, all of the isms, right? They are barriers to human development. They are barriers to human progress, and it is the suffering that comes as a result of humans not having the ability and the opportunity to develop themselves and to achieve progress is something that, is hurtful for me. It hurts my feelings, and I want everyone to have access to that possibility. Another thing, a 2014 study found that about 75% of white people said that they did not have a Black friend. And I'm not suggesting that you go out and get a Black friend, right? Like it's an accessory, right? But like,
Mhm.
what would it mean to you as a person in your development, Black or white, Asian, Indigenous, Hispanic, if you sought relationships with people outside of your racial in group? Or people who are straight seeking friends who are LGBTQ plus, people who are able-bodied seeking relationships with people who are disabled. Um, so that's the second thing I would suggest. And the final thing I would suggest is um, in your work environments, in your workspaces, look around you. Who's in the environment and who's missing? Why are they missing? And then what can you do about changing and impacting why those people are missing? But also thinking about what would be the benefit of having that person's perspective represented as a coworker, as a staff member, as a board member, as a volunteer if you're working in the nonprofit sector. And so I think those are three kind of like individual actions that we can take. Because I think oftentimes individuals, we get overwhelmed by the magnitude of systemic oppression. But it is one of the, if not the most important social issue facing humanity, especially after we've seen the massacres of Black people in Buffalo 2 weeks ago, and then of course this week the massacre of primarily Hispanic identifying faculty members and children in Texas. And so we have more power as individuals than we think we do. We have the power to change our networks and the people that we surround ourselves with. And we also have the ability and the power to change ourselves. And I think that's where the work has to start.
So our last question we have for you is, what are some quick tips you can give organizations in regard to implementing ADI, ADEI
Oh,
strategies?
yeah. So I think organizations, corporate, for-profit, nonprofit, should seek to institutionalize ADEI in the same way in which they have institutionalized other practices. For example, no nonprofit could imagine existing without doing fundraising. No for-profit business could imagine existing without doing marketing, right? And so the same ways that we have normalized the practices of good financial management, good marketing, good fundraising, we have to do the same thing with ADEI. And we also need to stop thinking about like the instrumental benefits of ADI. Although I know that it makes a compelling case for people when you say, hey, the US economy lost $16 trillion as a result of anti-Black racism. Are you really willing to leave $16 trillion on the table to hold on to your racism? Right? Like when you say it like that, it can make a compelling case and argument for why we need to lean into being anti-Black racism. But there is also a moral imperative and an ethical imperative around this work. Um, you know, ADEI is is an ethical thing, right? It is those of us who seek to create better environments for humans to exist and work, live, and play. It is an ethical imperative, and I'm compelled by that ethical imperative. And I feel like those of us who are doing this work have the moral authority to seek to push humanity forward and away from these systemic forms of oppression that harms all of us.
So a lot of things that you said has like been really eye-opening, especially even just changing the mindset of access and then like inclusion. Like I feel like a lot of people think inclusion is just including people,
Mhm.
but it's much more than that. Like you said, like it's making sure that everyone is enjoying their time or everyone feels like they can have the same experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I see ADEI as like building blocks, right? Like I always think about it as a stairwell, and at the bottom of the stairwell is access, and
Mhm.
at the top of the stairwell is inclusion, right? Like, and
Right.
so it's a way of thinking about how to like work through the process of raising up everybody, right? Like
Mhm.
not and I think sometimes people misunderstand that this work is giving historically minoritized folks benefits that they don't deserve. And it's like, really? Like anytime I see a woman, a person with a disability, a person of the global majority, a LGBTQ person, like in a space of authority, or in a space that has not typically been accepting and embracing of them, in my
Mhm.
head, I go, they are highly qualified, because
Mhm.
we know that historically they haven't had access to the same kinds of opportunities, right? Like, and a man is not always the best candidate. A white person is not always the best candidate. Like an able-bodied person is not always the best. It's just not possible.
I understand that. Again, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Madeline.
Absolutely.